Welcome to this week's discussion on pragmatics. I'm going to try to make it as brief as possible. Until now, we've been talking about internal workings of the language, things that are internal in the way we use language that impact the use of language. Now what we're going to talk about are external factors, the outside forces, the context in which an utterance is made. So we can see there's a list of examples in your worksheet on how the same sentence pronounced perfectly, using the perfect same words, using the perfect syntactic structure at the perfect time in discourse that it needs to be made, how that same exact utterance, perfect utterance, can have different meanings depending upon the context in which it is uttered. So I want you to go ahead and look at that list. English examples. And, I want you to remember that a statement like, can you take out the trash, can have different meanings, and I'm asking you to come up with some different meanings for that sentence. Mine surrounds something you may not have thought of, and that is, for example, I might be an editor, and you bring to me a book that you've written, and you want it to get published, and I'm looking at it, and I go, and I've read it now, and I come back to you and I say, can you take out the trash? Because I've had some objections to some of the tawdry scenes in it. But what I mean is, if you can do that, then maybe I could publish it. So maybe it's a meaning for that sentence that you may not have thought of. And I'm asking you to think of a couple more. And when we talk about context, we also have to talk about how sometimes things are taken out of context. And we've all heard that phrase, to be taken out of context. We have felt ourselves that sometimes our words have been taken out of context. We see in media all the time tiny little sound bites. Someone has given an entire piece of discourse, but this tiny little sound bite has been clipped out and spun and taken out of context. One of the most famous things is George W., after we got Saddam, appeared on this big carrier, right, with this big banner behind him that said, "Mission accomplished." Well, what was the context behind the speech that he gave that day and the banner being hung that day? What was the context? We don't, you can spin it various ways depending upon your political views. Some people will say that the context was, well, we got Saddam and that's what we really cared about and that mission is accomplished. While other people were saying, no, he was saying that we're done. Our work here is through. We won this war. And clearly that wasn't the case because we're still there. So it all depends upon what was the context and what is the perception of the context. All those outside factors have to do with what the meaning of that particular phrase had in our political environment. Now, one big part of pragmatic use of language is, remember, the sender has an idea of what they're trying to convey, and unfortunately they can't just open up their head and show it or project it onto a movie screen. They have to use words to do it, and as they're using the words, the receiver starts thinking, and projecting what it is that they think they're hearing or what they think the person's trying to say, and they draw conclusions about what they're trying to say, and sometimes those conclusions are correct and sometimes not, and if not, guess what? We have ourselves a little discord, a little misunderstanding, a little disconnect. And that's all part of drawing conclusions on a pragmatic level. Another pragmatic feature that we use is presupposition, where you presuppose that there's a fact that's true, but you don't overtly state it. You just go into the next idea. And I have friends who are famous for kind of coming in the middle somewhere, and you have to kind of figure out what they're presupposing. Or I could say something to my husband like, hey, what are you going to wear tonight? So that presupposes that there's something going on, that we're going somewhere. So he has to kind of go, something casual, because he's now presupposing that we had this plan, unbeknownst to him. So presupposition sometimes leads to disconnect and, again, can be discord, and the most famous being, and this is the one that I want you to look at on the internet, is when a lawyer says to a witness, "So when did you stop beating your wife?" It's the most famous presupposition that the guy had been beating his wife, right? Okay, I'm going to have you look at work by Gabriella Pohl. She talks first about implicature, and it's very closely related to presupposition. When you can presuppose that we have this kind of shared understanding without actually explicitly saying it, but I can also imply something without explicitly saying it myself, like saying something like, my neighbor is poor but honest. That presupposes, or it presupposes that poor people are not honest, or it implies that I believe that poor people are not honest. See, so the presupposition and implication are very, very closely related. Now, when you Google pragmatics, you'll see Grice's maxims come up a lot. We're ignoring those. There are two Grice camps. I'm in the con-Grice camp, so we're not going to address Grice and then try to refute Grice. We're just going to ignore him entirely. It's old work anyway. But I like Pohl's work because she talks about more tangible things such as scripts. If you go to the doctor here, in this country, you kind of know what sort of patterns you're going to follow in that conversation. And people in other countries and their doctors have their own scripts. I know for us, my husband and I, we have a basic script at the dinner table that we follow pretty much in this sort of pattern when we first sit down to eat. Those kinds of things. So those are the kinds of things we want to look at. And the bottom line with talking about pragmatics is you can have the pronunciation, the phonology down perfectly for the language. You can learn every single morphological rule and apply it perfectly in that language. You can get your tenses, you can conjugate your verbs, all of that. You can learn every single word in the language, in the dictionary, exactly what it means and when to use it. It's semantic use. You can develop these beautiful syntactic structures. You can know exactly what discourse rules, what back channel signals to send when, and when to give up a turn, or when to use a discourse marker. You can know all of those internal structural linguistic features and still not be able to communicate well, and still not have communication competence. Because if you don't understand the context in which you're doing all those things, you're not going to be a truly good communicator. And that's why, let's just talk quickly about these things. That's why C signing doesn't work. It doesn't care about communication. It only cares about the English language. It's why sign-supported speech, or SIMCOM, doesn't work, because they don't, all that cares about is representing in some words in no particular order, yada yada, what you're saying in English. It's also what makes it so difficult to teach children with autism, because you can work on all those pronunciations and all those words all day long and get that grammar down, yeah, buddy, but these children who don't have the contextual information, or don't have access to that, or can't access it, or prefer not to access it, are not going to be truly competent communicators. Okay, so that's this week's lesson on pragmatics. I'd love to hear from you. I would love to see some rich discussion regarding pragmatics on the discussion board. We'll talk to you next week.